Okay, we are live. Sorry about the delay, everyone. We had some technical difficulties here. So welcome to Boston Basic Income. Today we're talking about C.H. Douglas and social credit. So C.H. Douglas was an English engineer in the early 20th century.
I thought he was Scottish.
He was Scottish English. Yeah, he was kind of both. Yeah. So he basically he looked at the economy and noticed that it was basically impossible for people's incomes from jobs to allow them to buy everything that's produced in the economy. Because if you look at an individual business, they are always paying less for labor than what they're charging for their products. So he was like, well, if you just aggregate that across the whole economy, then it's impossible for workers to be making enough money to buy all the stuff that the economy is producing. So he looked at that state of affairs and he said, okay, well, this is the cause of some of the problems we're seeing in the economy. Like, why does there have to be so much borrowing? And, like, why do we have cycles of recessions and stuff like that? So that was basically what he noticed. He's widely regarded as a crackpot, not necessarily for that particular observation, but he... I should open up the article, actually. He settled. He noticed that, which I think is a really important insight, and then he kind of built more stuff on top of that, some of which is maybe not necessarily sound. One example is that in order to prevent inflation, he devised a system whereby the government pays businesses to keep their prices lower, which is kind of doesn't really make any sense. But I like the insight, and in terms of my personal history, C.H. Douglas was the first person who I heard talking about something like a basic income. So when I was first thinking about basic income, I was thinking about what if we had a world without copyrights and patents, then the economy would still be able to produce everything it was producing before, but certain people's incomes depend on those intellectual property markets, so people wouldn't have as much money to buy stuff. And then I kind of went from there, and I found out about C.H. Douglas and then Philippe von Parijs, and that's when I learned the term basic income, because C.H. Douglas wasn't calling it basic income. So we have an article that some of us read. I actually don't have it up right now because I just rebooted my computer due to technical difficulties. Sorry to everyone out there who was waiting, and everyone in here who was waiting. I kind of want to go around the room. You can pass if you want to, but for anyone who read the article, there's a lot of stuff in the article that's kind of confusing, but I do have some quotes that we can kind of get at. But I want to get people's initial thoughts on if they read about social credit, what they think. So you can start, Avi.
I'll pass for now since I didn't read the article. Yeah.
Okay. I have, I guess, a couple of questions based kind of on what you were introing with. One of them is kind of how this insight that we talked about was received and how it's received now in economics as well. And the second, I guess, sort of like popular reception and professional reception. And then the other question is, so you were talking about paying companies to keep their prices lower being kind of silly. It might be good to flesh that out. It might be obvious to everyone. But also second, in some cases we have subsidies, and I guess I don't know like the details of how subsidies work in particular industries, but it prompted the question for me, like how a subsidy is different from this idea of trying to like pay a company to, I mean, it's not necessarily a contract where you pay them and then force them to keep a price at a certain level, but somehow I think it's meant to reduce prices. I don't really know the details, so I'd be curious about that.
Yeah.
So I think subsidies are like the government reduces the cost for a company to buy like a certain good.
Yeah,
right. Whereas I think what Alex was talking about was preventing companies from overcharging consumers.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess those two things can be seen as two sides of the same coin.
Right.
But rather than just kind of like subsidizing something because he wanted more of it, which is what you typically think of as a subsidy, make it cheaper for people to do a particular thing, he was actually thinking about the general level of prices and
overall level,
having like a perfect subsidy that would keep the general price level exactly where it is.
Right.
Like paying people to keep prices at a certain level instead of just like cheaper than it was before or something like that.
So like when people say there are oil subsidies, what is being subsidized? Maybe this is a tangent. We don't have to talk about. Like the equipment that they need or the process of extracting the oil is partly paid for by the government.
Yeah, so I mean, I think generally speaking, if you think about like Iran with the oil subsidies they have there, there's a lot of oil in the country, so the government pays, like for domestic citizens and domestic sales, the government pays a large percentage of that to keep the price of oil down.
Pays what though?
Pays some part of the, so when you buy oil, right, you can imagine like if there's a sales tax on oil, it's like the opposite of that.
So they just pay for some of it for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
That's kind of generally how it works. I don't know the specific mechanics of how they do it. Yeah.
So I didn't read all of it. I read as far as I could until I got confused, and I was struck by the kind of model that he proposed about hardware and software. That hardware was the resources and the labor, the things that underpin the economy, and that the software were the things that you use to manipulate those things, like financial markets and banks and all that. I thought that was an interesting model.
So that was an analogy that the author of this article used to kind of explain social credit.
Right.
So this is an article, an introduction to social credit by M. Oliver Heydorn. So obviously, C.H. Douglas was around in a time before computers, so it's kind of like trying to change
and that actually provoked questions about how complicated the software part of it is now compared to when he was writing. And this,
So the basic idea is that, kind of what I was saying before, that we know the economy has the capacity to produce, enough stuff so that nobody is poor in terms of the resources that are available to the economy. And then the defect lies in not that we don't have enough, food to feed people or enough resources to provide for people. It lies in the fact that the rules that we use to allocate those resources are making it so that not everyone has access.
Right. And that I thought that was a good point, and you've made that point.
Yeah.
Actually, computers existed in 1830. A woman who was an inventor of a computer, and then
I guess the main point I was trying to make was like that analogy was not a C.H. Douglas analogy. That was a C.H. Douglas analogy. It was a Oliver Heydorn analogy.
Credit where credit's due.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyone have any other initial thoughts before we start getting to the quotes?
Should we go on?
The social credit is different from Yang's social credit in that Yang's social credit is doing like hours and you like trade it in.
So Yang has a policy called social credit or digital social credits, which I think he's renamed now to modern time banking. It's using the same words to describe something completely different. So that's not what this discussion is about. Yeah.
So my two questions with social credit is, well, number one, how do you prevent? First is who determines what is valuable in a system with social credit? I think is one question to ponder, and then the second question is like, how do you prevent a government from just instituting their own political values as opposed to just like what's objectively good?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really good question. I think one of the main things that C.H. Douglas wanted to emphasize is that the market economy still, is there, and it's still allocating resources based on supply and demand. It's not a centrally planned, system.
Yeah, I think your point might have more to do with the kind of social credit that Andrew Yang is talking about.
Yeah.
So we might want to define what this article is talking about for people who didn't read it.
So those
sound like very on-point questions to Andrew Yang's policy to me, so I wonder if you're thinking
Oh, I see. So the kind of social credit idea, way of thinking about it from C.H. Douglas. Actually, I can redo this quote. So here, to give you a little background, they're talking about this gap that I was talking about between workers' wages and the prices of all the goods and services in the economy.
Okay.
So the social credit solution to the problem of the gap is to have a politically independent organ of the state, a national credit office, continually issue, on the basis of the relevant statistics, a sufficient volume of credit so that consumers can purchase the surplus of goods and services that are being produced, i.e., those which cannot be bought because no income to offset their costs has been distributed in the course of their production. This credit is to be issued free of debt and in lieu of the conventional palliatives that are presently employed in attempting to manage the gap. So this national credit or national dividend it's a basic income. That's basically what it is, despite the fact that there's a comment in this article where he says it's not basic income. But it's basic income in the sense that we define it here, which is a regular income unconditionally paid to every individual person. So that's kind of the and the social credit way of thinking about it. The reason why it's called social credit is that C.H. Douglas has this idea, which I think is basically right, that if everybody's working together and contributing to production, then there's an efficiency gain that happens from everyone cooperating and specializing, and market, like you gain efficiency, you gain productivity from that. And he calls that, what does he call that? It's like the unearned social increment of cooperation or something like that.
You can just hit Control F and then type that.
Yeah. Unearned increment of association is what he calls it. But so there's a lot of interesting terms that are used within the social credit community that kind of come from C.H. Douglas and elsewhere that are not, they don't necessarily map, they maybe map onto some of the terms you're used to, like, okay, efficiency from cooperation and all contributing to production together, efficiency from specialization, which is terms we're used to hearing about, but he calls it unearned increment of association. So that's why it's called social credit, because it's this idea that we all associate with each other, that creates a surplus, and we should all benefit from that surplus. So it's kind of like this justification for a basic income. Yeah. Go ahead, Richard.
The problem with that is that will have no incentive to produce more than that.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Than what the costs of things are, because they would just at the end of the year they would, or whatever, I think it said somewhere like that. The National Credit Office would give enough money for the people to buy the excess, so business won't want to have any excess.
Wait, why? If it gets bought?
Yeah.
But it would just be bought at cost.
Oh, I see. You can't jack up the prices.
It's not bought with any kind of profit.
But isn't everything bought at cost because of the weird price leveling thing that Alex mentioned earlier? That you're only allowed to sell. I mean, there's a lot of confusing things in the article, so
Wait, I'm
really
really
wrong.
lost.
But there's a bit about so 2 paragraphs down, selling goods.
This is what you're looking for.
Selling goods below cost to the consumer and making the difference to the retailer would allow for production to be sold at its just price, i.e. the price that reflects its real cost. This would involve a national discount on all consumer items.
Right. And I think so I don't think he has a theory of inflation that, I don't think he really has an understanding of what causes, general prices to go up over time, that kind of thing. And he has this idea that it's...
I think he said something about, much earlier in the article in this, about how people I get credit, and then the credit devalues the currency, and that causes inflation or something.
Yeah, so when I said he doesn't have a theory, I guess what I should have said is that he doesn't have a reasonable theory.
So wait, Alex, I think that this is I didn't read the article, and so I know at least Avi didn't read it either, and so it's very hard to follow this conversation.
Right, so
there's a lot of different pieces of his plan.
I would say don't. Let's not bring up other parts of the article. So when I say he doesn't have a theory of inflation, I want to start talking about inflation a little bit rather than what he said, what was said somewhere else in the article.
But do you think it would be helpful to kind of outline the key aspects of his plan for us right now, so that when we're going through the different quotes, we have a context?
The key aspects of his plan are that there's a gap between wages and the prices of goods and services in the economy, and he wants to fill that gap using a basic income. That's it.
So that's his problem. That's his problem. But how does the basic income work, and what's all this stuff about waiting till the end to give people when does he give people the money, and what's this issue about changing prices?
It's distributed regularly. It's just a basic income.
So then what's this issue of only allowing companies to sell things at a certain price?
So there's two aspects to of his plan. One is the basic income or the national dividend, and then the other is his plan to fight inflation, which doesn't make any sense.
Which is a
So we should
separate
kind of
thing.
like keep those two discussions a little bit separate.
Okay, so his plan to fight inflation is what you were talking about before, where he pays the companies to keep the prices low.
Right.
So it doesn't necessarily create an incentive problem as someone was raising for the company to produce the stuff, because they're getting paid by the government, like, to keep the price low. So they're getting paid for either way. It's just that the consumer's not paying. It's like it's kind of like a subsidy.
It's a specific kind of subsidy.
Yeah.
Is it that they set the price and the government pays them, or the government sets the price at
That's
which
a good
they
question.
pay
That
them?
seems important.
I think basically what they want to do is they want to look at the balance sheets of these companies and see what their costs are, and then what their profit margin is, and kind of make up the difference.
So they basically pay the price that the government will pay the price that the company sets.
The idea is that the government pays the profits for the company.
The profits,
and then the consumer only pays the costs of what went into the production.
Okay.
But now you've got an incentive problem where businesses have an incentive to just keep raising the prices as much as they want, because the government's
that was probably where you were going with that. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense.
So it's not really workable. It's not.
Okay. Because you had to have like the free market to know what that profit margin was, and now you've like screwed that up.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Pretty much. Yeah.
That makes sense.
So this is why I like to say that he had some important insights, but he was also getting a lot of stuff wrong too.
Yeah. And can I ask one more question? Why was he worried about inflation happening with the basic income? Like, he obviously came up with this whole second part for a reason, right? He could have just had the basic income idea.
Yeah. So it's not entirely clear to me. I think he kind of, in his mind, he was thinking that inflation was caused by this gap between consumer prices and the costs that went into production, and that people would borrow money in order to be able to pay those costs, and then you'd have more credit in the economy, and that would kind of create a spiral of inflation. Wages would go up, and because businesses would borrow more, and like that kind of thing, it would create like a wage price spiral. So he had some kind of like fuzzy, intuition there.
And that happened more with the basic income?
That it's not that it would necessarily happen more with a basic income. I mean, I don't think he had a sense of how monetary policy worked. And we were everyone was still figuring out monetary policy back then. When he came up with social credit, we were still on the gold standard and all of that stuff. Right. So, I think when he initially had this intuition that we need to give people money, he had to come up with an answer to the question of what about inflation, right? Okay. And he didn't say, oh, well, the central bank can tighten monetary policy and raise interest rates, because that was not necessarily a concept that was at the forefront of monetary thought at the time. Right. So he kind of came up with this convoluted alternative. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
When did he come up with this theory?
So his book Social Credit was published, I think, in 1924 originally. Okay. And he had been, I think, after World War I was when he really started thinking about it. Yeah. So it was pretty early in the 20th century. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, thanks. That was helpful for me, at least.
Yeah.
Good.
During World War I, there was a lot of like issues with like gold being traded between different countries and things like that.
Yep.
And so currencies were like devalued and like.
Yep. So this paragraph is just about the part about how he kind of controls inflation. And I think, the answer, of course, in real life is that as you increase the basic income, as people have a more direct source of spending money from the basic income, that allows the Fed to tighten. They don't have to overstimulate the financial sector anymore to kind of create unnecessary jobs and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of like the answer that I would give today. But the answer that he came up with was, in order to accurately reflect the physical reality, a certain volume of the compensatory credit would be used to lower retail prices in accordance with the economy's overall consumption/production ratio. The true cost of production is consumption. Hence, production should not cost in financial terms more than was spent on the consumption that was necessary to bring it into existence. Selling goods below cost to the consumer and making up the difference to the retailer would allow for production to be sold at its just price, i.e. the price that reflects its real cost. This would involve a national discount on all consumer items. Yeah.
Why wouldn't he think of it as equivalent to give the money, like to give that money to the people and keep the prices the same? Like assuming his worldview was correct and you could do this?
He's worried about a positive feedback loop of inflation, of this kind of like wage price spiral. So he doesn't think that, oh, if you just don't do this, prices will be at a higher level. He thinks they'll keep going up. I mean, that's kind of the answer. It's not necessarily an actual explanation for what would actually happen.
I'm not sure I understand that, but maybe it doesn't matter. Yeah.
I mean, it's just the way he's thinking about it, he's trying to prevent continuous inflation.
Yeah, I just don't see why giving it to the people would create continuous inflation.
It wouldn't, but that's how he's thinking about it.
I guess I don't see why he was thinking it would do that, but...
Right. And if there were continuous inflation, then doing this certainly wouldn't prevent it.
Right. Yeah, and doing this creates that other problem of the companies wanting to raise their prices all the time.
Right, so and that can be inflationary as well.
Yeah, that seems worse.
So then you have to pay them even more because now there's even more money circulating, like that kind of thing.
It's sort of like what happened with stagflation in the 70s.
In what sense?
The wages kept going up and then prices kept going up and...
Yes, so there is such a thing as an inflationary positive feedback loop, an inflationary spiral. And this was known at the time, like people had seen this happen before.
Right. So they're worried about it.
So he was worried about it, yeah. And I mean, early 1920s, that was around the time of the Weimar Republic and all of that with their hyperinflation.
Yeah.
So naturally he was getting questions about inflation.
Yeah.
And he had to come up with an answer despite not really having a theory of inflation. Yeah. Brian?
So his viewpoint makes sense from like a production standpoint for dealing with actual goods. But what about as far as services? I'm a house painter. Like, what's my total output expected to be for the year? How do you calculate?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Really good question.
Well, I mean, I think a service is a kind of good.
Yeah, but I mean, what would be the price? Like for the just price for...
Like what's the resource that went into it?
Yeah.
Is the question,
like how do you price the person's time or something like that?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess that's the right question to be asking. And the way he would answer it is that you'd price in the wages of the person providing the services and all of the tools and equipment and resources they needed to provide the service, and then you'd add it up. But of course, if they're getting paid more, they can just raise their own.
But
their
also,
own
like,
wages.
if I work for myself, then there's no difference between that and the amount that I get paid. Like what I charge for my labor as a plumber if I'm self-employed is the exact same
so your
thing.
profit is the wage because you're just one person, you're not a company.
So it doesn't really have a profit margin unless I work for another company that's skimming something off or something.
Yeah.
Additionally, you also run into the problem of people are more skilled than other people, right? So if I've been training as like a painter for 5 years and I can get the job done a lot quicker than someone else, I should be being paid more despite using the same amount of tools or whatever.
Yeah. So I've read, in preparation for this, I read some of his book, Social Credit, but I didn't read all of it. I imagine that he does have answers to some of these questions. I don't think if I read through the book that I would be convinced by his answers. I think he probably just adds more complexity to try to kind of address these issues. Yeah,
that's a good question.
But it's the right question to be asking. Yeah. Let's go to the next one. So Douglas's basic diagnostic claim was that if the true or correct purpose of the economy is to deliver, with the least amount of labor and resource consumption, the goods and services that people need to survive and flourish, then the reigning financial system is not properly designed to yield this result. And I think that's exactly right. I think this he's getting right.
This kind of speaks to my question before about like the insight you described at the beginning where wages are going to be less than profits, obviously, right? And so like people are not going to be able to buy everything. How is that received by economists and by others?
I think so Keynes did name C.H. Douglas as like one of the heterodox, iconoclast economists that you need to be paying attention to. So he did get some recognition. Keynes was also viewed as out there by a lot of contemporary economists at the time too.
Right.
But he was very popular in some circles, and it started a whole political movement too. There was the social credit political movement. It turned kind of into a religious movement later on, like Christian fundamental, and then it became like an anti-abortion party and
So it really
stuff
went
like
somewhere
that.
else, yeah.
Yeah.
There's even that. It said in the article that in 1934, they had a whole commission in Alberta or something like that,
Yeah.
and then the first universal credit government was formed in 1935.
Yeah, so Alberta Canada was run by the Social Credit Party for a while. One of the first things they tried to do was implement, this kind of basic income. They actually issued special, Alberta bucks, or I don't know what they were called, but eventually the Canadian national government said you can't do that. You can't, create money in this way. So the party lived on for a very, very long time. But they only actually tried to do the basic income thing at the very beginning, and then it became about other stuff.
Right,
Yeah.
because they weren't allowed to do that.
Right.
So I don't know if I actually agree with Douglas's diagnostic claim here,
Okay.
only because I feel like an economy is also geared towards, in some cases, providing like higher quality of goods rather than just pumping out goods for as cheaply as you can in terms of labor and resources. And I
Okay.
guess my go-to example is if you look at military contracts that the U.S. gives out nowadays, a lot of times they will overpay just to make sure that their products are like 10 times or 20 times as safe as just paying, the set price for it.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But then the company undercuts bids, and so that they can keep going on and on. Like F-45, the new fighter plane, they bid like $10 billion, and then it's like the final product was $50 billion because each year they kept going up and up and up.
So
Because the cost overruns or whatever.
I wonder.
So-
Go
I
ahead.
think it's true that a big part of it is providing higher quality products.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't think this paragraph here precludes that either. I think when it says, the goods and services that people need to survive and flourish, I think that
Gotcha.
includes, it's more than just kind of like subsistence. It's also more of the things people want and, better things for
Gotcha.
people as well.
Gotcha.
So I think it's included in there. Yeah. You guys ready for the next quote?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
What social creditors refer to as the national dividend, or basic income, is justified morally by the fact that each citizen is rightly regarded as a shareholder in his economic association and as an heir to society's cultural heritage. It is the cultural heritage, the inventions and discoveries of past scientists, engineers, organizers, etc., which makes the greatest factor in modern production, the real capital, possible. And it is the real capital which, as we have seen, is primarily responsible for the price-income gap. Therefore, the most appropriate way of filling this gap would be to recognize that individuals are the beneficial owners of the real capital and deserve to receive a dividend on its operation. So the real capital, let me just define what that is. That means like all of the technology and equipment and stuff that's been built, stuff that humanity has developed that we use continually to contribute towards the productive process. So tools and inventions and all
Like
of that.
science
That's
and
the
institutions.
real
yeah.
capital. Yeah.
Sounds like Marxism a little.
Um,
I mean, that everyone has a share in the production of the
yes.
product. The labor is all having a share in that. The means of production, is that the phrase? Having a share in the means of production?
Yeah.
I think it depends though, because for Marxism, everyone has like the exact same amount of like the product, whereas for this one, it's only like a percentage of the total profit.
And I think
Right.
this is also saying that it's not necessarily related to the work that you're doing. If I'm following correctly, it's because I'm not quite sure if it does what it's related to.
Well, it's this idea, again, the unearned increment of association, the economic association. So the idea that we're a society and the fact that we're all together as a society ends up producing value that, we kind of all deserve to share in. It's kind of this moral argument.
But
It's like Yang's argument about.
It's like what?
Like Yang in his argument about, we deserve a share of
yeah, we're all
Google and
shareholders
we're all
of the country.
get
Yeah.
our own data.
Yeah. So I'm not a fan of these types of arguments. And the reason I'm not is because it's possible to give everyone free money and it makes people better off. Therefore, why not do it, right? It doesn't really matter what happened in the past. It doesn't really matter necessarily what people deserved. If we care about people and we care about people's well-being and prosperity, the question is, what can we achieve? Not why is it morally right to do the things that benefit people the most?
It's more of a justification for why to do it, and you're saying
It's a
you
moral
don't need a
justification.
justification.
You need a
Right.
justification for why it works, why it's
Right.
possible.
Right.
You don't necessarily need a moral justification
Right.
for like people deserve this.
Right.
As long as you assume the basics of we care about people and we want people to be as well off as possible.
But one
Yeah.
thing we've talked about a lot in here is like people always typically try to offer like some kind of justification.
Mhm.
And
Moral
sometimes it's
justification,
like,
yeah.
well, I don't like to use the word moral because, as you know, we've disagreed on whether your point of view is also moral. But like some kind of deservedness justification beyond just like it'll
Yeah.
make people
Yeah.
better off.
Right.
And so that's interesting. And like this one is kind of like the closest to just like we care about people for being citizens because it's pretty amorphous.
Right.
And it doesn't really
Economic
depend on
association.
anything like
Yeah.
specific things like oil or like your particular contributions now or in the past. It's just kind of like a vague sense that, obviously we get to benefit from the culture we're born into. I mean, that happens even without a citizen, a national dividend that we benefit and lose whatever. We bear the fruits of and costs of the society we're born into. But so it's like, it's pretty vague, but it's interesting that he's still trying to turn it into like, therefore it's okay to like help people be better off.
I think you're right that it's like a step removed from you put in this amount of work, therefore
Right.
you deserve to be rewarded.
Yeah. Or like even the land ones we were talking
Henry
about
George.
try to be more specific. Like somehow we used to be able to use the land. I don't know if that was even true really, but whatever. And then like this idea that now we should still own it kind of. Like the more specific, I think the more trouble you run into.
Right.
If you just care about making people better off, because then you're kind of like tied to that specific justification. And if something doesn't quite fit with that justification, then you can actually not give people the money.
Or you might end up with a basic income that's lower than
You would want it to be.
than the amount you could afford.
Yeah.
Or you might end up with this idea that the amount of money people deserve is way higher than what the economy could sustain or something like that. Like we run into that issue with reparations, right?
Right.
You know, like people
Like
say
we're
like there's
talking
no
about
amount
last
that
time.
could make up for it, you know, like that kind of thing. It's like, well, okay.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that, and it clearly points to something psychological and social that we always see these justifications.
Right.
So,
I think that's right. Yeah.
and not always. Like I think there are people who just focus on people's well-being as well as the reason to do it. But this idea of deservedness is also super relevant. I mean, people want to know why. Why do people?
I think the
deserve to
biggest
have it?
issue is it's hard to quantify like how
Yeah.
well a person is,
Yeah.
only because stuff like happiness and fulfillment or whatever,
Right.
like there's just no number you can put on it.
Right.
It's true,
So-
but it's hard to quantify how much people deserve based on their historical. I don't know what.
Yeah.
too.
It's interesting about Yang
Yeah.
again, though, too, because the biggest applause line, if you will, was in the debate when he talked about let's not talk about what we deserve, but we're human. We all, so we
Yeah,
all need
right.
to thrive.
Yeah.
And,
That's true.
and people love that. So maybe
Yeah.
it's, changing from
Yeah.
you need to pull your own weight, bootstrap thinking.
Yeah.
Right.
So I like this take on it. I like thinking of universal basic income as our inheritance from our forefathers.
That's interesting.
I didn't build the interstate system,
Right.
but Amazon makes great use of it, zipping around all over the place and creates this wealth. So I see a lot of this. So let me ask you, Alex, because you've given this more thought. So 400 years ago, the Pilgrims step off the boat.
Sure.
Could you immediately say, "Hey, here's free money," and ramp up the economy that way?
Yeah. So I think any economy, if it's really, really small scale, then what you're probably not going to have is you're not going to have a market economy as much as you're just going to have like a small community, small tribe, small family, that kind of thing, and you don't really have like a monetary economy. I think once you start having an economy that's a large enough scale that people are actually using money and specializing and stuff like that, there's some amount of basic income that the economy can sustain. It may be very tiny for a more primitive economy or something like that, but there's some amount of basic income the economy can sustain. And what you don't want to get into is you don't want to get stuck in the habit of saying everyone has to earn their money from work that they contribute, because then you trap yourself into creating work for people to do for the sake of giving them money. And now you're not creating the work because you actually want the product of the labor. So you have to continually adjust the basic income to make sure that you're not inadvertently creating jobs as an excuse to give people money. Because then that's really inefficient.
But I think part of what you're saying has to do with, do they deserve it, in the sense that they haven't done anything yet. They're just here. And they haven't built the culture. They don't have the inventions and all the stuff that we're talking about here.
So the fact that we've built up the American economy to a point where we can have a sustainable basic income we can provide for everyone's needs. I mean, isn't that really our inheritance from the Pilgrims 400 years ago?
You could frame it that way. It could also be that, we land on a continent that's just abundant in resources, and, it would be silly to get everyone to produce the things that are already available around us. We don't need to inherit it from anywhere. I think when you say we inherited it or we deserve it because our ancestors made it for us or something like that, that limits maybe what's possible to achieve if you're trying to justify it or rationalize it on those terms.
Just as a pedantic point, there's no point in history where you don't have cultural inheritance, because every small scale society, just as a point, like the Pilgrims already had a ton of cultural inheritance. They brought their institutions, they brought their scientific knowledge, they brought and then even small scale societies, like nobody is born able to survive. They have to. I always point this out, but they have to learn all this stuff that their culture has figured out over generations and generations. So it's kind of always true that there's something that people inherit that allows them to survive and thrive as much as they're able to survive and thrive.
I think that's right. And I think cultural inheritance, it contributes to the capacity of the economy to provide for people. There are a lot of things that contribute to the capacity of the economy to provide for people. And we want to activate that full capacity to the extent that it's sustainable and we're not, destroying the planet and stuff like that. But yeah, it's for me, it's less of, we deserve it because our ancestors put in this work, or we inherited, it's something we deserve. It's something that we inherited because it was available and now we have it. We should make the best use of it, just like we should make the best use of all of our resources. Yeah. Avi.
So would you be in favor of cutting welfare in order to increase the basic income? I don't know if this is off topic.
Yeah.
No, I'm just curious about it.
It's a good question. I think if you look at if you look at the state of the economy as it is right now, with all of the programs that are in place right now, there's a certain level of basic income we can afford right now, without doing anything else to any other programs. So I would say, let's find out what that is. What is the maximum level of basic income the economy can sustain? Once we've done that, we might take a look around and say, wait a minute, what's the point of even having these other programs? Because, it looks like they were solving the problem that's now being solved by basic income. Right. So I would say that there's, once you have basic income at the highest sustainable level, you might look at other programs and say, okay, we don't need those anymore. That allows you to raise the basic income even further. You might look at some programs, like maybe healthcare or something like that, and say, oh, well, this is something that is still most efficiently provided by the government rather than the market. So the basic income funds the market. I think, there are certain resources that are most efficiently allocated by the market. One of them is food. But it's not most efficiently allocated by the market if people don't have money to buy food. So you solve this problem by ensuring that consumers broadly have money, have access to the market. And that's something that could, people aren't going to not buy food for themselves.
And then if you take something like a soup kitchen, maybe they'll close because nobody needs them. Or maybe they don't because for some reason people still seem to need them because they spend all their money on something else, or maybe you have a few that stay open. I guess, just to reiterate an example of Alex's model where you kind of see what's needed. Some things people would means test out of at a certain point. And of course there are inefficiencies to welfare programs, which we've also talked about here, like the fact that sometimes you can't earn additional money if you're in the program.
There's the welfare cliff.
There's those kinds of cliffs. So people might, start wanting to opt out of that if they had a big enough basic income, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I think it's basically, once we have a basic income in place, there are problems that basic income doesn't solve. And we can find out which problems those are once we have the basic income in place.
Like addiction
and
treatment
figure out how to address
centers
them.
or like
Yeah.
healthcare or
Like what?
addiction treatment centers, things like that.
Right.
You might still have lots of services that you.
And disability
Exactly.
services, which
I
we
mean,
talked
we talked
about.
So
that, yeah.
education, military, healthcare, roads and bridges, interstates, that kind of thing. These, there are resources that are most efficiently allocated by the government, and that's always going to be true.
Yeah.
And then we can have a debate about, which resources are most efficiently allocated by the government, which ones are most efficiently allocated by the market. Basic income funds the market,
Yeah, and
regardless of where you
we
land
don't
on
even
that.
call a lot of those things welfare. Like we don't call roads welfare.
Right.
So in a way, I think like the ones we call welfare are roughly overlapping with the things that are trying to solve the problems of people not having money, which is also the
Right.
problem that like basic income is trying to solve. But there might be some in the Venn diagram that don't.
Right.
Quite.
I think it is true that we have this fundamental problem in our economy, which is lack of a reliable source of consumer spending money, and we compensate for it in a variety of different convoluted ways. One of them is the various welfare programs, but then it's also this monetary overstimulus of the financial sector, and that leads to asset bubbles and financial crises and recessions and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that we're doing that are really inefficient because we don't have a basic income, and we won't have to do as many of those things anymore once the basic income is already in place. There's no reason to get rid of this stuff that we're depending on before we put the basic income in place. But certainly, maybe it allows us to raise the basic income higher once we do kind of phase some of those other things out.
And that could be like more jarring for people too, like to remove it before you're used to the basic income.
And monetary policy in particular, it's going to automatically, the Fed is automatically going to tighten as you ramp up the basic income. So that's not something you even have to legislate. Yeah, Richard.
Well, what about asteroid mining? In the next decade or so, that it's projected that we're going to be able to mine asteroids that are worth quadrillions of dollars, while the concurrent economy is worth only like $100 trillion world economy, and so that would crash the economy, a single asteroid.
Yeah, I read this article.
I don't know if I buy that, but
yeah, I read this article about an asteroid that's made of gold, and the person who wrote the article was worried that if we found that asteroid and mined all the gold, it would crash the gold market and ruin the economy. And I I think the problem there is that we're assuming that the economy depends on something like gold having like a specific fixed value or something like that. But there's a reason why we don't use gold as money anymore.
Yeah.
And we did for a little while because it was a decent proxy. But if we had a ton more gold, that would make gold really cheap, and that's fine, whatever. It's going to be
the
fine.
asteroid made of gold come from? Anyway.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's an asteroid belt. It's like there's numerous asteroids in the asteroid belt. They're worth trillions of dollars or quadrillions of dollars, and with platinum and nickel.
Oh, really?
And
Asteroid mining.
I read it a little
They're worth
differently.
that much at today's prices. If they flood the market, then they're not going to be worth that much. The same way, a fishing boat coming into the harbor can drop the whole price of.
Yeah.
I mean, personally, I think we're a long way from asteroid mining, only because you hit issues with transportation and stuff where we're not even looking at being able to transport enough by weight of gold. You're using that much gas or whatever in order to get to the asteroid belt.
But you can you can transport the asteroid to us and put it in the
Orbit?
Yeah, not orbit, but in the longitudinal orbit, and it's always in the same place, and it just travels at the same speed all over. And then you can bring
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to get into the details of asteroid mining. I think the interesting thing about that take is just the idea that having an abundance of something can be bad for people, and it's interesting because it's actually true in some cases in our economy the way we have it structured now. We don't want China to sell us cheap steel because we want to force American workers to produce it, because we need those American workers to have jobs, because jobs are the way that people get money and stuff like that. I think anytime you see something where there's more of something that's valuable and it ends up hurting people, there's something wrong with the way we've designed our economy. Yeah. So I think that's, generally something to pay attention to. So you guys ready for the next quote?
Yep.
Yeah. So the social credit analysis reveals that the core problem with the existing economic order has nothing to do with physical scarcity or natural barriers to production, nor with defects in human nature, nor with the free market and private ownership of productive property as such, but rather with the economy's operating system, i.e. with its financial system. It is not merely that financiers and their corporate accomplices make self-centered decisions or often engage in white-collar crime. The fundamental problem with finance is structural or systemic in nature. So I think that's right.
Yeah.
You know, when people talk about the 2008 crisis, they often focus on, kind of the corruption involved, or the scams, and the credit agencies giving bad ratings, and people being greedy and that kind of
And
stuff.
that happened too.
It all happened,
Yeah.
And
but it's not
revolving door between government and industry.
that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
And all of that stuff is true, and it's there, and it happened.
Yeah.
But it's not the ultimate reason
Right.
why we have these types of financial crises. It's because, the Fed allowed that amount of credit expansion to happen because they wanted to sustain consumer spending. And, this had the side effect of fueling asset bubbles. And, if people had been more on the up and up, that would have just meant that the Fed would have had to stimulate more for the fact, to compensate for the fact that people weren't doing all these bad things. Like, it wouldn't have, if you fix all of these problems and make everyone a good guy who's doing the right thing, it actually doesn't fix the underlying problem. Yeah. So I think that's kind of a
And
little
how
bit
would you
what
describe it? The underlying problem again?
the underlying problem is that consumers need spending money. They don't have a basic income. So
that underlying problem.
we
Okay.
use we use alternative mechanisms to get spending money into the hands of consumers, and one of them is overstimulating the financial sector, which allows businesses that maybe shouldn't be in business to continually roll over their borrowing.
Overstimulating is really what you're
But I
talking
guess
about.
and I guess the idea is that there's a way in which the government and society wants the financial sector to be getting really big, because some of that money is like trickling to people, and that's how we're getting those people money.
Right.
And then, as a product of that, you see like all this craziness, and then we say like, oh, why is there all this craziness? Like, this craziness is so bad. But it's a product of that way that mechanism gets people
Yeah,
money.
just trying to get at what Alex thought the mechanism really was. And
So the mechanism is that in a situation where consumers don't have sufficient spending money, we come up with ways to give them spending money, and these ways are problematic, and that's what caused the 2008 crisis.
right.
So,
I mean, do you think that that's a commonly held view?
No.
I didn't think so. Because, I mean, most people talk about it as, like the real estate bubble and bad lending. And I mean, I
Right.
never hear it talked about
But I
that
guess
way.
two things that somebody might talk about commonly, like people understand the relationship between interest rates and how big the financial sector gets, right? So that piece they would talk about.
Yeah.
And people also understand the relationship between interest rates and keeping prices stable.
Right.
So that aspect of it is also common.
They talk about it like there's this balancing act between, not allowing the economy to dip into recession and not overheating it. And then you have to find like the exact right point. But the reality is that using the kind of conventional monetary policy, you're always overheating it. And it's always on the verge of falling into recession. And it's just a matter of time before, enough private credit builds up that you have a kind of disordered credit collapse or something like that.
So the way Alex would see it is you're kind of always choosing between, like you're always giving people less money than they could have, and you're always overheating the financial sector. And that balance is just about like not giving people too little money, or not overheating the financial sector like too much.
Right. And it's not
and
just...
so there's always like these compromises.
And it's also true that there's not like a sustainable balance where if you keep it perfectly balanced, you're just good forever.
You're
it
never
will
gonna have a
eventually
cycle.
destabilize. It's like inherently unstable. And that's why you have the credit cycle.
I thought the main issue with the housing crisis was that the banks were lying about like the credit, right, or something.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of incentive problems where at one level you don't care about the credit of the borrower because you know you're just going to sell that debt off to the next guy up in the hierarchy, that kind of thing. So there's no accountability there.
Yeah.
But even if there had been accountability, if that particular problem hadn't existed, the Fed would have had to have found other ways to stimulate borrowing, to prop up consumer spending. Yeah. And also there's an incentive for the government to want to make it easier for people to buy homes, easier for people to get mortgages, so that's part of it too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when Douglas wrote this, England was still on gold standard, right? So is his comment about the financial setup, is that a dig at fractional reserve banking and the way that, is that what he's talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that he's actually. I'm not sure about that. I don't know if he's critical of fractional reserve banking in general. He does keep talking about like debt money versus debt-free money that the government can just issue. I mean, I would argue that it's all debt. It's just a matter of who's making the promise. Is it the government or is it a bank or something like that?
If they were on gold standard, then it wasn't debt money, except when the banks loaned out money they didn't actually have and created debt money that way. That's what I took away from it.
Right. But even when he's talking about paying out the social credit, he's not talking about paying out gold. He's talking about paying out
credit that is not backed by debt or something like that.
Yeah, that's kind of the framing that he uses. I think it's just a matter of. I think what he's basically getting at is that it's more unstable if it's all depending on the private financial sector. And he's kind of using these like this one is debt based and this one is not as a way of kind of like drawing a distinction. Yeah. Yeah. You guys ready for another quote?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is the one we just did. Yeah. To be sure, the standard financial system has a number of problematic aspects, but the core difficulty has to do with how it undermines or subverts the economy's circular flow. Like many natural processes, the economy incorporates a pair of complementary cycles, the one physical and the other financial in nature. Households have what businesses demand, and businesses supply what households demand. People go to work, supplying the firms with labor or land or capital, if that's what they own, so that goods can be produced. In return for their labor or land or capital, they receive money which they spend on the market to buy goods and services that they have produced.
Yeah. I got confused here.
Yeah. So basically the intuition here is that money is flowing in one direction, goods and services are flowing in the other direction, kind of at all times. He also has this idea that it's circular, like the money circulates around the economy and then the goods and services flow the other way and kind of get consumed, that kind of thing. Or like that's the ideal. And this circular, this circuit is being interrupted by the fact that, by this gap that we talked about where businesses are earning profit over and above, what they're paying out to the workers.
I don't understand households have what businesses demand.
The businesses want their money. Want the money of households.
Businesses supply that part I understand.
And the businesses want their work too,
households have
right?
what businesses demand. What does that mean?
Businesses want your money.
I thought it was your work and stuff.
I thought maybe it was work or.
I think it's talking about money.
Okay, it's not.
He says work or land or capital. I thought it was.
So households and businesses supply what households demand. People. Oh yeah, okay.
It's all.
People go to work to supply the firms with. Yeah, okay, all right. So he's thinking
labor.
He's thinking of the labor. Yeah.
And
That's
capital.
a weird way to frame
Capital
it.
is just money, right?
Capital is not just money.
Oh, it's not?
When they're talking about capital here, it's talking about real capital, like
machines,
like machines and stuff like that.
and land. So all the stuff that we have that we can.
All the productive things that we
Productive
use
stuff.
that don't get used up as like consumable resources in production.
Right, but I mean, businesses basically demand all those different things that can help make stuff.
Doesn't the business own its own land and capital though? That's where I got confused.
Yeah,
I
usually,
agree.
but I guess sometimes not.
Yeah, what are the households doing?
Some businesses rent their property. Like a lot of businesses lease where they have
So,
their storefront or something.
I mean, you're thinking of like contract work and stuff, but the vast majority of
Yeah.
businesses own their own like resources in terms of like materials,
Right.
machines, or whatever.
No, yeah, actually, during the holiday season, Amazon and things like rent their robots to fulfill their sales.
There's both, like stores in Somerville usually
Yeah.
rent where they have the store, and
Right.
they sometimes can't stay there, stuff
I
like
think
that.
it's households that bothers me too.
Instead of people, you mean, or
Or households. Yeah, what is it? It's like families. I don't know. It doesn't.
Child
right?
labor
So
is-
household. I mean, like.
Child labor, yeah.
I think, kind of, it's been typical in economics to think of, an individual person is not an individual economic unit, because really it's a matter of like, you have a family, you have like,
Right.
a man and a woman and the
Oh,
children,
okay.
and that's
Okay.
that's the economic unit.
So
Yeah,
it's like
'cause
thing,
the
yeah.
money-
the economic unit.
Yeah.
In the
of
19
what businesses
In the
demand.
1920s, the labor that was earning money might have only come from the father, not the kids or the mom,
Right.
or maybe the kids, but not always.
So maybe the household is a single man, or maybe it's a married man with a wife, or maybe it's a whole family,
Yeah,
right?
it's weird.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah.
But so is this restating something from the original writer, or is this the writer writing about?
This is restating something from the original writer.
Okay, so then
From C.H.
that's-
Douglas.
Mm.
So it's just this idea. So, I mean, like, I think you're right that when it says households have what businesses demand, they're not talking about money here. They are talking about the labor, like they're able to provide the labor. But it's this idea that kind of in an ideal economy, the money is circulating to the labor, and then it's circulating back to the businesses,
Business,
through consumption. And that is kind of perpetual, and it just keeps going.
I guess consumers would work better for me than households.
Yeah, I think they're saying, I think part of the reason they say households instead of consumers is because they're thinking of the households as both the consumers and the workers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So there's like this dual role that people have as
Right.
both a consumer and a worker,
Yeah.
and they're kind of thinking about them on equal footing.
Yeah.
But I would say that, because the economy exists for the benefit of the people, the most important role that people have is the role of consumer,
Yes.
and that the only purpose of you would only want people to work to the extent that it actually provides creates a product that the consumers would want.
Well, I just think the point you're trying to make here, though, is just that some views say that that the amount of money you get through labor should balance to the amount that you're spending.
Right, and I think that's the problem that C.H. Douglas wants to address, and that's how he wants to address
He thinks
it.
they don't balance, right? As things are. in this
He
world.
thinks they don't
Yeah.
balance as things are. I think they don't balance as things are. He wants to make them balance using his policies. I want to acknowledge that they're not supposed to balance,
Right.
that, there's money flowing into the productive economy and goods and services flowing out, and it's always going to be that way.
But how is he making them balance? Because he's also giving people a basic income, so it seems like the same thing.
He's also giving people a basic income, and he's trying to kind of he's also trying to kind of close the loop so that there isn't extra profit of the
I
businesses,
see,
and
yeah.
keeps the prices lower to keep the circular flow of money going and stuff like that. So yeah, I focus more on saying, hey, money flows in one direction, goods and services flow in the other direction, and it's not a circle. Yeah.
So how do services fit in here again? I understand how the firms are producing
So-
goods, but
Yeah, so usually when they say goods, that includes services. So, and economists do this too, like a service is just a kind of good.
So if you're self-employed, you're kind of the laborer and the business all in one person.
You're talking about self-employed versus employed at a business. Is that what you're emphasizing?
kinda. Well, yeah, I get
Or
a job
contracting.
working in Richard's factory, and then I got to pay someone to watch my kids while I'm at work.
Yeah.
And
Right.
now there's demand for daycare services.
Right. So, I mean, I guess the important distinction is between whether the person is self-employed or whether you're paying a company. So if you're paying like a child care service company, then you can see how that would be kind of analogous to just buying a good from that company, whether it's a child care worker or child care robot or, some kind of just putting them in front of a movie or something. I don't know. Yeah.
Isn't he calculating out like how much the perfect factory will produce in a year? Whereas services are more fungible, right? Maybe my kids are sick, they don't have to go to daycare today.
Right.
So how do you calculate that out? Or do you don't worry about it?
How do you calculate it out?
Is he trying to calculate how much a business will make in a year? I didn't read it, so I don't.
Isn't he trying to calculate how many widgets a company will produce in a year?
I don't think so.
Make it balance out? No.
No.
Okay.
I think he just wants to know the cost that goes into the widgets, like
Right.
into each widget, I guess, no matter how many
Okay.
they do.
Yeah.
Because he wants to reimburse the profit on the widget. I mean, I still think you run into some of those problems with services, like what is the profit if you're self-employed?
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
isn't one, but
I wouldn't say that
Yeah.
that services. I wouldn't make a distinction between goods and services necessarily. I think it's probably the same both ways. If you're thinking about, so you're trying to think about how do you quantify how much of a service is produced? Is that what you're saying?
Right. If I make
Yeah.
widgets, I can make 1,000 widgets a week. If I'm a lawyer, maybe I work 20 hours a week or 40 hours a week.
Right.
Right.
So you could do it based on hours. You could do it based on like
there is output. Yeah.
number of cases handled or something like that. You'd use the same kind of logic for either goods or services.
It is harder with services.
Yeah,
I
it
think.
is. Mhm.
I mean, services are kind of good. There are other goods that are also difficult to figure out as well.
There's like no objective way to do it though, because
I mean, this is why we have markets,
that's why,
right?
yeah.
This is why we have, we can't, figure out, absolutely what people need. So, we let, supply and demand and the price mechanism and all of that. This is why we have markets, because you can't just make these calculations. Yeah.
And services can fluctuate depending on the knowledge of whoever's providing it and all of that, as we talked about. But it's
Yeah.
also true that goods prices fluctuate depending on where you are in the country and what quality they are.
You mean they
who
can
makes them.
vary,
I mean, there's
yeah.
still
And
variation
also
even
what
there.
the services could be obsolete because we have a robot that can do that.
Yeah, right.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Or less in demand at least.
I'm thinking about like luxury goods and how much of the price would have to be reimbursed. But then also the function is to show that you can spend money on them. So this whole theory doesn't work for costly signals, I don't think.
Yeah.
Because people want to show that they can spend the money.
Right.
They don't want to pay the at-price cost of a manufactured diamond or something. Like, that would make it worthless to people. Anyway, I guess he wasn't thinking about that kind of stuff.
Yeah. You guys ready for another one?
Sure.
One more thing
Yeah.
about if you're self-employed, which I am, and I have to pay as a company, I have to pay a self-employment tax that's different from an individual tax. So that's different from, say, services that have to do with contracting. That may be through another company or through yourself. But if you are the company, then that's a whole other way of administering or producing the services and goods.
A whole other way?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of measuring profit, measuring costs
Yeah,
of goods.
I mean, if you get into like how, the tax code, accounts for various things, there's all kinds of complexities in there. And I would say this is, these are some of the kinds of complexities that you really don't want to think about if you're thinking about, as a person, you don't want to think about it, but also people who are thinking about it, economics don't really want to think about it either. These are like details of financial accounting and stuff like that.
Right, yeah.
I think, they try to make it so that, you are a worker at a company that is you. That's kind of like how they try to do it. And then you can kind of think about it as like along the same lines as you are an employee at a company. It just happens to be you're an employee, you're at a company of one or something like that.
Yeah, it's
right?
confusing. I mean, I get unemployment reminders, or to fill out unemployment forms for my employees.
For your employees, yeah.
Which are
But I
yourself.
am the employee,
Right.
but I still get all the same. It's all the same apparatus
Right.
Yeah.
working.
So
But it's not.
is this related to a question about how any of this stuff
Well,
works?
it's related
or-
to the question of measurement, I guess, which you're saying is really left better to the accountants and so forth.
I would say it's left better to the markets, ideally, and that you would only want to kind of make judgments about these kinds of things in situations where the markets are not efficiently allocating resources, and that includes labor or anything. Yeah. So it's very challenging for the government to do things efficiently because they don't have these market signals. They're not like a for-profit business, and they're not competing necessarily in an even playing field, that kind of thing. So we need to be very careful. I mean, there are things that are obviously need to be provided by the government, but there's also it's going to be very tricky to know where to draw the line because you're making some sacrifices when you try to do this stuff manually, like figure out, how much of something is worth it and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yep. So here's another quote. The fundamental assumption of the orthodox conception is that the production of goods and services automatically distributes sufficient money in the form of incomes to meet the costs and hence the prices of goods and services. This state of affairs is sometimes referred to as Say's law, after the 18th century French economist Jean-Baptiste Say. Supply creates. Yeah, we did have a discussion, an entire discussion just on Say's law. If you guys are curious, you can go check out that video. So supply creates its own demand, or in financial terms, the flow of prices is automatically balanced by the flow of effective demand in the form of incomes. On this view, in a given economic period, a claim.
Wait, no. If in a given economic period.
If in a given period economic period.
Yeah, there's that problem. Yeah.
A certain volume of production is going unsold. It is because people are saving their incomes instead of spending them. So I think this is kind of, it's talking about the gap again, the gap between the incomes that people get from labor and what they're able to spend to buy
Or it's
things.
saying that the standard view is that there isn't a gap.
The standard view is that there isn't a gap. Yes.
But how does the standard view account for like the fact that some amount of profit is being skimmed off the top at all times?
So let me justify the standard view, even though I
And that
don't
there's
think
always
it's right.
some saving too.
Yeah. So you could imagine an economy where everybody is producing their own stuff and then trading some of it to other people and consuming the stuff they get. So the profit they get goes into their own consumption, almost.
I see.
Like the person who's can produce 10 coconuts and five fish, and another person who can produce 10 fish and 5 coconuts, and so they trade. Whatever.
Right. They specialize based on their comparative advantage, and everybody profits and everybody consumes, and it's all even.
It's all balanced.
It's all balanced. Yeah.
Right.
And it just kind of keeps going that way. And I think people sometimes have this idea in their head, or economists at least, that this is kind of the ideal economy and this is kind of how it's supposed to work. Everyone's contributing something and they're getting something back. And maybe some people are contributing less and therefore getting less back, but they're still consuming based on what they contribute, that kind of thing. And if they wanted to consume more, all they have to do is contribute more and that kind of stuff.
I think the standard view is that the market adjusts for it. So like if you're not operating efficiently, like you have too many jobs or whatever, you get replaced by a company that does operate more efficiently than you do.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's this prevailing idea that prices will just adjust, so that if people are not buying everything the economy can produce, then all the prices will go down until market's clear and everyone's buying everything again. So that's kind of like the justification of kind of the standard view.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I
guess we can do a shout out to next week, which is on deflation.
Next week we're talking about deflation. That's true.
Is relevant to that.
Which is relevant, yeah. Is it okay to let all prices in the economy just go down? Usually I have all these tabs queued up, but I had to reboot my computer when I was figuring out the technical difficulties at the beginning.
That's why I say you should have like copy and then paint and then have like a border around all of it, or create a PDF and then highlight it, or
Yeah, there's options. I do save a backup of which quotes I chose, so that's good. Did you guys want to talk more about this one? The idea
kind of similar to the other one.
Yeah. Okay. So Douglas's great contribution to economics was his discovery that under modern industrialized conditions, the basic assumption of economic orthodoxy is false. Say's law does not hold, i.e. the circular flow is not characterized by an automatic and endogenous equilibrium. Instead, the flow of consumer prices is greater than the flow of incomes that are distributed in the course of the corresponding production, i.e. wages. There is, in other words, a chronic and inherent deficiency of consumer buying power. And I would say that, yes, that is generally true, and we make up for it in these other ways that are potentially harmful, Yeah.
What does endogenous mean?
I had the same question.
Yeah, so endogenous means
is like within the system.
coming from within the system,
Yeah.
so that it's inherent to the system.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not like something So exogenous would be that there's some
From the
external
outside.
force that's
Yeah.
causing things. This is all a product of just the way things work. It's endogenous. Yep.
Wouldn't it be outside the system? Because I thought indigenous with like an I.
Oh,
No,
indigenous.
endogenous
terms
versus
of-
exogenous.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So indigenous
Right.
is separate.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Right.
Indigenous is separate.
Different.
Like you just don't use it in this context.
Yeah.
It's
Oh,
like
okay.
it's like endothermic versus exothermic.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yes.
Yeah, these are like the
Warm-blooded and
econ terms
cold-blooded.
for these things. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. I guess what do we want to say about this? Does anyone have any thoughts about this besides endogenous? So it's the idea that if you're expecting money to circulate around between people, it's not automatic that circular flow is just sustained on its own.
Right.
So
Yeah.
how was he responding to the idea that the profit just gets respent into the economy efficiently?
How is he responding to the idea that the
Well,
profit?
so wasn't his point that there's a gap because profit is accumulating or something
Right,
like that?
yes.
So then you were saying the orthodox view is that profit just gets respent into the economy on goods and services, so it's not
Right.
really accumulating or messing with the flow. So then what would his response to that be?
I'm not entirely sure what his response would be, and he often gets criticized. So there's something he says called the A plus B theorem or something like that, and it's kind of what I was saying before, that you have a certain amount of money that's spent on production that goes into the wages, either the
Right.
wages of the people or the wages of the people who provided the resources that you bought or something like that. So that's A, and then there's this total price of the goods and services that you sell, which is greater. So there's this gap that they're not the same number. And a criticism of that that people often give is that he's just making a fallacy of composition, because that might be true at the level of one individual company, that's always going to be true. But then if you look at the system as a whole, then you see that these profits are being spent elsewhere in the economy, and it all kind of works out. So that's a common
I
criticism of
see.
C.H.
So
Douglas.
maybe he didn't do a good job addressing that criticism.
I don't know that he did a good job
Yeah.
addressing it. But I think he's right. And I think he's right because people do like to accumulate money without necessarily spending it back into the productive economy, because you can think of money as being this potential to buy things, and people like accumulating that potential even if they don't actually use it. So I think he is right about that. Yeah. Yeah. So here's the next one, or no, it's not. So this is just going to be emphasizing more of what we were just talking about. So this gap between consumer prices and incomes is the problem par excellence with the existing financial and economic orders, and any monetary reform proposal which does not adequately compensate for it in line with the economy's true purpose will merely be beating around the bush, or else exacerbating the perennial economic dysfunction. So the economy's true purpose, again, is to provide the goods and services that allow people to flourish and survive and that kind of thing. Yeah.
So this is the author of the article kind of agreeing with him?
Yes. So I think that this is right. This is, and any, not just monetary policy, but any economic policy, I think there are a lot of people who have these kind of revolutionary ideas about how to change things. And often it's rooted in kind of notions of what's fair, it's important to keep in mind what the goal is. What do you want out of the economy? We want the economy to be maximizing the benefit to people, right? And you have to keep that in mind anytime you want to change anything, right? So I think that's what this is emphasizing. Yeah.
Well, if that's your definition of the economy, doesn't that mean you should be for almost subsidizing, I guess, volunteering services that you aren't for now?
Subsidizing volunteering services?
Right. So, for example, let's say if someone volunteers on like, I don't know, like the suicide hotline, or someone volunteers to clean up a road or something.
Sure.
That's providing benefit to the economy, but they're not getting anything back. So if the true notion of the economy is to maximize the amount of benefit that people receive, we should have something like, you know, Andrew Yang's kind of thing, where we're kind of trying to at least quantify work that isn't really like monetizing.
Well, I think, you know, the way I like to think about it is that most of the valuable work that people do that's important for society is not paid, right? The labor market is a market for getting people to do something different than what they would ordinarily do. So the reason we pay people for work is to provide an incentive to do that work. And it's only necessary in a case where without the incentive, they wouldn't do the work.
Gotcha.
In terms of maximizing people's benefit, that's more on the consumption side. That's more, how do you give people access to the goods and services the economy can produce? And you don't necessarily need to tie that to, you know, work, justify it based on, oh, these people are doing valuable work, they're just not being compensated for it or something like that.
Right. So if jobs that people sometimes volunteer for, like if there aren't enough people doing that, or if like the government decides there would need to be more people, then I think Alex would say like then you should pay them like anything else to get them to do it.
Gotcha.
Right. But if they're already doing it enough, whatever, then that's great, and just let them.
Gotcha.
Yeah. That would be your view, right? Alex?
Yeah, and there's a lot of incentives out there, right? Like a lot of times we do things because of social incentives and stuff like that. The only time we need monetary incentives, the only time we need like these market incentives is when whatever incentives are already there are not providing the outcome that we desire.
Sometimes market incentives, especially if they're smaller, I mean, if they're like in a small zone, can sometimes even reduce the behavior because they crowd out social incentives, because now it's not clear if you're doing it for the financial incentive or for another reason.
Right.
And so, you know, it can actually, there are other incentives and they can be doing a better job in some cases than a financial incentive would be, unless you like pay people a lot or something like that.
And I think some people talk about, you know, like paying people is about recognizing the contribution of their labor or something like that. I don't think that's necessarily a useful way to think about it. I think it's more...
Like Andrew Yang's answer during the last debate.
What did he say?
That, what was it? That economic value gets mixed up with human value or something like that.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, you know, if someone's doing something really valuable and that's what they want to do, that's great. You don't have to pay them. If they, you know, everything I just said, I guess.
And you could never have an efficient economy where you were paying people well proportionate to the value they created anyway, because there's other factors that affect like how much to efficiently pay someone. So of course we already see that that's not, you know, the scarcity of who is able to do it, like how much people are willing to do it without being paid. These things all factor into the price.
I think what Abby was talking about would be covered by Bernie Sanders' federal jobs guarantee.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, the issue with the federal jobs guarantee, I think obviously based on what we were saying before, is that it's the example, it's the epitome of kind of creating jobs to give people money, right? And you can talk all you want about how, you know, oh no, these jobs will actually be useful, we'll find something productive for them to do. But if the reason you're trying to find something productive for them to do is because you want to give them money, then you are by definition creating jobs that are not optimally productive. If we have work that we want doing, we should absolutely pay for it. If we have things we want done, we should absolutely pay for it. We should do it using the minimum amount of labor possible. We don't want to waste people's time, and you know, we don't want to waste other resources either. So I think, you know, the jobs guarantee is, I think it doesn't make sense as a policy, and most of the advantages that people tend to put forward when arguing for the jobs guarantee are things you could get without guaranteeing people a job. Like they want, you know, like, oh, we need to train people up and have a buffer stock of labor that's available to be activated at any time. Great, that's fine. Figure out how much of that you need and pay those people to, you know, train them up and that kind of thing. And, you know, you're doing that because you want the product of the labor, not because you have X number of people who aren't employed and you need to keep them employed.
So would you be against a minimum wage in that case then?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
So I, you know, people sometimes ask me, hey, Alex, if you could press a button that would eliminate the minimum wage, today, would you press that button? And the answer is no. I mean, this is something we're depending on. This is, but in the grand scheme of things, if you're imagining an ideal economy, and you're imagining that the labor market is just, like to provide incentive for people to do something different, it could be really efficient to pay someone a small amount of money to do something that they ordinarily slightly prefer to do something else instead of, but like pay them a tiny amount of money, like that's all fine. Minimum wage is only necessary and only makes sense because we are expecting people to get their incomes from jobs.
Right.
What you were talking about before, Alex, about having people on guard, prepared to do it, is sort of like the Army National Guard or something like that, and where they have to like prove that they're up to the task once a year or something like that. Or you could do that with oil, or not oil, like steel mills or something like that.
Yeah, and all of these are reasonable things to do, but you have to make the trade-off. You have to say, okay, if we are employing people in this way, we're paying an opportunity cost over what they would otherwise be doing with their time. That's not an easy calculation to make. That's not an easy calculation to make, but it's kind of the perspective we should be thinking of. It's not like they're unemployed, therefore they're doing nothing useful, and we're going to make them do something useful. You've got to compare how useful the thing you're going to make them do is compared to the thing they otherwise would have done. Yeah. And the way you make them do it is you lower the basic income until they need a job, right?
Or you pay a lot for that very specific thing.
Right. I mean, like those.
Which would lower the basic income maybe like a little bit, but
yeah. I mean, I like to say, so sometimes the jobs guarantee people say that the goal should be to achieve full employment, and then they define full employment as everyone who wants a job has one. Another way you could achieve full employment by that definition is just raise the basic income until
nobody wants a job.
Until none of the people who don't have jobs want jobs, right? Then you've achieved full employment, right? Yeah. And then you've done it in a way that is giving people more freedom.
I like to think about I think an interesting perspective on minimum wage is that it makes a whole range of trades illegal. Again, we depend on it right now. I'm not saying it's doing more harm than good necessarily right now, but we think of it as kind of forcing those with a lot of power to help out other people, but it also prevents people just generally from paying people small amounts to do things. So that's the kind of cost that Alex was talking about.
Like with McDonald's, I think there's already machines that can deep fry French fries and flip burgers, and there's kiosks, so you can pretty much automate the entire thing.
One of the issues you run into problems with job security. I mean, I can take this argument even further and say that we shouldn't have salaried jobs. They should all just be when there's a problem, you can come and just fix it, right, for hourly work. But then it's an issue of, I mean, maybe I haven't thought about this maybe as much as Alex has, but
you don't think about it 24/7 all the time.
You run into an issue where people don't know if they're going to get the work.
Yeah, and that's a problem. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up because, another thing we talk about a lot in here is that one thing I think people don't always think as much about is, obviously, the more outside income you have from a basic income, the more bargaining power you have.
Right.
So, the more unattractive a job is, the less likely someone's going to want to take it. And right now, certain people don't have that many different options for jobs. So you have to take any job, right? And so that's why we need all these, other protections. But assuming that you had a decent-sized basic income, jobs might not be able to offer jobs with terrible job security, or maybe they would, but it would depend on how much people were annoyed by that. And I'm sure you'd still get salaried jobs, especially when people had to put in work or education to train for them in the first place. They might not be willing to take a job where it's totally unpredictable what they're going to be doing and what they're going to be paid.
So
I think that helps. Contracts in England.
So I think Bethany's point is exactly right. I think ultimately what you would want, I mean, you want labor to be allocated efficiently and that kind of stuff. So I think what you'd end up seeing if you just let businesses do what they want is that, and you have kind of basic income at the maximum level the economy can sustain, is that for certain types of jobs you would still see them be salaried because employers need to make that promise to their employees in order to get them to do the work at the price that they want. Maybe I'm an employer. If I offer a salary, to someone, maybe I can pay a lot less, and I know I'm going to generally need them on a day-to-day basis
It also
anyway.
can be more efficient as a side point, that as opposed to trying to track how many hours they actually need and
Right.
let them do the task.
So it's going to largely, I think, depend on the business
Yeah.
and the type of business and the type of job that you're hiring people to
Right.
do, and different companies, different industries might work out different standards on what's most effective for them.
Yeah.
And you can also, like a lot of people talk about, reducing the work week to 15 hours or something like that. If you just don't have any rules about what the work week is, you can imagine that there are some jobs for which, they're willing to pay a lot more to have one person work 80 hours than to have two people work 40 hours. And then other ones where, it's fine for people to do, a couple hours here and there, and, that's what's efficient in that industry, that kind of thing.
Depend on the nature of the work.
Yeah. There's definitely, in terms of what's optimal for the labor market, you're not going to see kind of everyone contributing the same hours of labor. It's about getting the overall level of labor contribution in the economy to what we need, and then some people might not be working at all, some people might be working a lot, depending on how the market sorts itself out.
Optimal free ridership.
Yeah, optimal free ridership, yeah.
You would expect to see more people volunteering and things with universal basic income.
I would think so.
Yeah.
I would expect that, yeah. I mean, you'd expect to see more people volunteering, you'd expect to see more people happier with how they're spending their time, even if it's not in strictly volunteering, but they're being paid to do something, right?
There's an article about how charities contributions would go way up with universal basic income, because people wouldn't they would work and then they wouldn't need the universal basic income, so they would donate most of it or something.
Some people would,
Yeah.
And we talked. Andrew Young talked about political campaigns too.
Yeah.
Donations.
Yeah, he brought
sorry,
that up. Yeah.
in terms of the people that just don't have any expendable income
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
to donate. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought a lot of it.
Yeah. So here's the last quote I'll read tonight. The national dividend, which must not be confused with a conventional basic income, is justified pragmatically by the fact that the economy needs an injection of debt-free credit in order to function in a real or self-liquidating equilibrium, and it needs to provide those whose labor is no longer required in the formal economy on account of technological advances and improved production efficiency with an income so that they can nevertheless purchase goods and services. A policy of full employment makes absolutely no sense when the efficient production of those goods and services which people can use with profit to themselves does not require, within the context of a modern industrial economy, the full capacity of the available labor force. So I think all of this is exactly right, except the part where he says it's not to be confused with the conventional basic income, because that's exactly the justification that I would use for basic income. Yeah. So you can dig into social credit a lot more. There's, endless material out there. You can read, they have archives of all the stuff that C.H. Douglas ever wrote, including his books and stuff online. It's interesting stuff. I think he recognized some actual important problems in the economy, and a lot of those insights have been overlooked, partly because of some of the other stuff he said that was a little wackadoo. Yeah. So yeah, we kind of want to go around the room, get people's final thoughts on social credit. C.H. Douglas. Yeah, Avi.
So I guess final thought on social credit. I definitely do agree that with the premise of that, you have to cycle in as much as you get out. Yeah, I think that's just where I stand, more or less.
Yeah, this is interesting. I guess in terms of that cycling, I'm also thinking what guarantees that your current cycle is sort of the max production level that you would want it to be? And is there presumably is something in the standard view that says it should be like that, and maybe something that obviously you disagree with is not like that right now. So that's another interesting question, because you could have a self-sustaining system, but that could be underproducing relative to the capacity that you could have if things were more efficiently managed in other ways.
I guess the only final thought I have is about the true purpose of the economy
Sure.
in relation to people who don't need a basic income. So to fulfill the true purpose of the economy means to bring everybody to the point where they're not starving, let's say. Well, but a universal basic income is for everybody.
Right.
So it's sort of overshooting the mark, you could say. The true purpose of the economy, it has been met if everybody in the economy is satisfactorily comfortable and
No, the true purpose of the economy, he wouldn't say, is just to provide for people's basic needs. It's to provide for the full flourishing. So that would be, I think he would say that would be the maximum benefit to people. Yeah.
the
So I don't think.
maximum benefit to people, but that's all people.
Yeah.
And then, so that makes me wonder about the fairness argument and all of that.
I kind of agree with that take. I mean, you could make an argument that a negative income tax, if you're looking primarily to eliminate poverty, that a negative income tax is better than just a universal basic income.
Right.
But I would still say that a universal basic income is better because you don't hit problems like the welfare cliff, where people don't feel like they're being punished for trying to do better.
And also,
Right, no, and we've talked about that and how it
Yeah.
is better, but it still is an issue if you're talking about the true purpose of the economy, that phrase.
Right.
Yeah.
Then you're definitely not fulfilling the true purpose of an economy if it's still all this unequal kind of wealth, and people who are not, maybe they're not in poverty, but they're certainly not wealthy.
And also with your income tax versus the universal income, I read that an example is that if a woman like divorces a husband or not divorces but separates from a husband that earns like $200,000 a year, and she has to prove with a negative income tax that she needs it, and she might not have it for however long, and then. In order to get the $12,000 a year, or however much it is.
So I think just to kind of be clear about the distinction here, a negative income tax in terms of the distribution is exactly equivalent to a basic income and an income tax combined.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's reasons to do it.
What?
Well, you have many thoughts on this.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the most important thing is that the distribution part of the giving people money part is just kind of unconditional, and it goes to everyone. That way you don't fail to give it to someone who
Right.
needed it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I understand.
Then you can do the income tax on the income tax side. If you want to pair the basic income with an income tax,
Right.
and you can call it a negative income tax if you
Yeah.
want. What worries me is if you're implementing the negative income tax and it's all just kind of happening at tax time and people have to file their taxes, then you run into some problems of people who need the benefit don't get it and that kind of thing.
How so?
Well,
Because you
it's
have
hard
to,
to navigate.
you'd
the
have to
system.
file the tax,
Yeah.
your tax return in order to get the
So then
benefit.
it'd be a whole year. You mean that?
And you have to navigate the system and file it
Yeah.
properly.
Yeah.
And the,
Right.
the
Yeah.
government's incentive is to give out as little as
Right.
possible. And so there's
Right.
like that incentive is not aligned
Right.
with.
If everyone just gets the payout automatically,
Yeah.
then it's up to the government to make sure that everyone's paying their taxes. It's not up to the
Right.
individual to make sure that the government's paying them their benefit.
Yeah.
Like with the earned income tax credit, only like 30% of the people who qualify for it get it, and with
Yeah.
the IRS, they actually do audit people who get who have like minimal amount of money, far more than the wealthy, because they don't have as much resources.
So I wanted to get back to people's.
Yeah.
We were kind of
Okay,
going
yeah,
around there.
sure.
I wasn't sure. I didn't really follow what you were saying.
Yeah, I was just kind of fixated on the true purpose of the economy,
Right.
And how that could be a true purpose when some people are already fulfilling, the true purpose of the economy.
I'm
If
really
it-
not following.
Okay.
I think she feels
Well,
like some people are already flourishing in the economy. So
Right.
why give the basic income to them is, I guess, maybe
Oh, is that what you're
the
saying?
question.
Yeah, kind of.
So
I
the
mean,
idea is, what do you do to make sure the economy is doing the best it can for everyone, not just
yeah.
the richest people, but everyone?
Yeah.
And then if the answer to that question has a basic income in it, then we should do a basic income. If the answer to that question is something other than a basic income, then we should do something else. But the question is, what's the most efficient effective mechanism for getting spending money into the hands of consumers. And I would argue, as I have, that basic income does that. It makes the poorest person as rich as possible. And there's no way to necessarily get the poorest person more money through some other means.
Right.
Yeah.
But that
That's what I
also
would argue.
includes giving the rich people that basic income, which they don't need.
But
Yeah.
as you said, if you want to take it away, you can do it on the tax end.
Yeah.
If you
And
wanna
that's
take
where-
it
so
away-
we're kind of going
Yeah.
back. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's okay.
Right.
We can move
So
on.
if you
Yeah.
want to take it away, you can do it on the tax end. But then there's
Right.
also the question of does taking the money back away from the rich people, does taxing the rich people actually make the poor people better off? Or does it
No,
or does it
I don't
potentially
think that
make
it
them
does. I don't think that's the
or
point.
or does it potentially make them worse off, right? Or nothing. Or
I
does
think
it have
it's a
no
fairness
Right.
issue, and I think it's a perception issue from
Right.
just in terms of policy.
So if,
Yeah.
so I mean, if you're thinking about fairness, then maybe it's worth it to sacrifice the well-being of the poor in order to take the rich down a peg. You might argue that.
No, I'm not saying that either.
Someone could.
Someone
Anyway.
might. Let's have one of them.
Yeah. Let's go to Brian.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. It's an interesting topic, but
Yeah.
he uses that phrase in the last quote, the debt-free credit.
Yeah.
So again, if the country is on the gold standard and it's banks that are issuing debt credit to people,
Yeah.
is that what he's digging at and saying they should stop doing that because that's what's creating the gap?
I think that's what he's digging at. I think depending on how you define debt, I mean, I would say if the government is issuing credit, that's also debt, but it's government debt rather than private sector, financial sector debt. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't feel like I have particular thoughts. It was like interesting, like discussion. There's definitely a lot of weird, like financial, like reading through the article. I was like, there's a lot of weird financial stuff in his arguments.
Yeah. It's really hard to find a good, well-written article about C.H. Douglas.
Yeah, I mean, not a critique of you.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, there's a lot of like weird, like along with the like social credit that's effectively a basic income, even though he doesn't want to call it that. Like,
right.
He has a lot of weird financial ideas.
Yeah.
Along with
I think
that.
someone suggested.
We'll go to Richard first. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Well, universal credit is an interesting idea, but there are so many flaws in it that's why people don't really take it seriously. Like with his weird inflation theories and things like that, and so people overlook good ideas because some of the other ideas that people have, that the person has, are flawed.
Yeah.
And so you need to look at everyone has very good ideas and bad ideas. You just have to take the good and ignore the bad.
Right.
Yeah, it can be hard because you kind of have to have this filter. You can't just listen to
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky thing.
Yeah.
So Derek says on the live stream, he says, I recommend Money and the Price System for a brief self-written summary of Douglas's views.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think since we didn't really have a clear idea of that, that's probably good advice. There's also an interesting radio recording of him out there in which he describes his theories about the social economic sources of war and how national dividend would solve these pressures. Yeah, and I think I haven't listened to that, but I think the idea that war is in some ways a jobs program is something that's true. Would we have had World War II or any of that if we hadn't had the Great Depression and people didn't have enough money to spend and that kind of thing?
It's still a jobs program even now because a lot of people in the rural areas in America, they don't have any jobs, so they go in and join the army or something because they don't have anything else to do to get an income for their families.
Yeah. All right.
I
Well,
would argue you probably would still see World War II because people are just kind of greedy. They're trying to take as much as they can.
I don't know. Maybe.
I
Yeah.
don't know.
World War
World
II
War
was
II.
like,
Yeah.
like the aftermath of World War One, and like had Germany.
There's a lot of factors.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I found this article on the same site, a national dividend versus a basic income, similarities and differences, which maybe should have been the article I chose for this discussion. It's written by the same guy. But I think part of the reason he's saying it's not basic income is because he's defining basic income as a government insured guarantee that no citizen's income will fall below the level necessary to meet their basic needs, and that's definitely not how we define basic income here. So I think that's probably why he's defining basic income differently, and he's defining it as a basic income guarantee, which is something different. It's not for people who already have money, that kind of thing. Okay. So great discussion, everyone. Thanks, Brian, for coming down from New Hampshire.
Yeah,
thanks for coming out, Avi. Next week we're actually going to be on Monday because Bethany and I are traveling, and the discussion topic is going to be deflation. So we talk a lot about inflation here. Next week is going to be about deflation.
I liked your image for it.
Yeah.
Football.
It's good. We got a deflating football as our image. Yeah. Right.
Deflategate. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.